In this episode of Plants of the Gods, join Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with ethnobotanist and anthropologist Dr. Glenn Shepard. In the first of a two-part episode, Dr. Shepard and Dr. Plotkin examine the role language plays in understanding ethnobotany, how shamanism is perceived in a changing world, and much more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Plants of the Gods. This is Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team, and my esteemed guest today is my friend and colleague, Dr. Glenn Shepard. Let me start out with a quote of Glenn's, because I think it's one of the most evocative and well-written pieces ever on the Plants of the Gods. And I quote, "Psychoactive plants have played an important role in medicine, religion, ritual life, and recreation since ancient times. In shamanic religions, which appear to have dominated throughout much of human prehistory, trance induced by psychoactive plants and other techniques permits direct contact with the divine. For this reason, plant hallucinogens and other psychoactive botanicals have been considered by cultures throughout history as plants of the gods, sacred substances that bring knowledge, power, healing, and mystical insight, but that must be used with utmost respect and caution." So Glenn is not only a great ethnobotanist and a great human being, he's a wonderful writer. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I've been waiting for this for a long time.
Well, you're one of the august few, but we're glad to have you here. You're such a unique well of information, it's almost difficult to decide where to start, but let's start at the beginning. I'd like you to define for us ethnobotany and tell us where you think the science of ethnobotany is going from here moving forward.
Well, the simple definition of ethnobotany is knowledge and use of plants by indigenous and non-Western peoples. And these days, we're talking about Western ethnobotany, Italian ethnobotany, French ethnobotany. So it's traditional uses of plants for all purposes, medicine, psychoactives, eating, all uses of plants. But the history of ethnobotany sort of began before there was a word for ethnobotany. The history of ethnobotany goes back to the curiosity of peoples all over the world about what medicines and poisons and foods that their neighbors were using. So it goes about the word itself, ethnobotany, wasn't coined until 1895, but there was a definite interest of the European explorers who were traveling all over the world to find peppers and spices in the plants of the indigenous peoples they found. So during that colonial period, the discipline, or before it was a discipline, this interest in neighboring peoples and indigenous peoples' plants had a very strong economic component, which is why it was called economic botany for a long time. And it was about exploiting the knowledge of traditional peoples for the benefit of colonizers mostly. And I think ethnobotany carries that sort of moral weight of that colonization history. And so I think the future, the current, the present, and the future ethnobotany is about finding ways for that scientific knowledge to become into dialogue with indigenous knowledge and to have the benefits of that flow to humanity in general, with the case of medicinal plants, but also especially back to indigenous peoples to support their traditional lifestyles, their struggle for land rights and cultural rights.
Well, we live in a world where rainforests are disappearing and polar ice caps are melting and indigenous peoples are being confronted at all sides with modernity pressing in. So what's the future of ethnobotany? Why should students study ethnobotany if we live in a world that's not going to be as pristine as the one into which you and I were born into?
Well, this is the irony, because students love ethnobotany classes. Every time you offer an ethnobotany class, the enrollment, it's through the roof, and you get people from sciences, you get people from humanities, from psychology, from music, from the arts, from theater. They're very popular classes, and yet the academic institutions that offer ethnobotany seem to be giving up on it, which is it's one of the great paradoxes in a moment when ethnobotany would seem to be more important than it ever was in terms of drug discovery and this critical dialogue with indigenous peoples, which everyone is talking about, and yet who is better at dialogue with indigenous peoples than ethnobotanists, ethnobiologists? And yet you look around the country and all of the prominent, Richard Schultes was at Harvard. When he retired, no one filled his shoes. Brent Berlin left Berkeley, no one filled his shoes. When he retired from Athens, the program shut down. And, Hawaii had Tamara Tickton, had Nina Etkin, and when they left, those spots weren't filled either. And so there seems to be, I think specifically because ethnobotany falls between the cracks, between the social sciences and the natural sciences, the social science, the anthropologists look at it as biology, and it doesn't fit into their scheme. And the biologists look at it as sort of kind of weird anthropology. It doesn't fit into their schemes. And so whenever it comes down, when the funding decisions need to be made, like who are we going to hire, what's the lab we're going to invest in, the anthropologists invest in their stuff, the biologists invest in their high-tech stuff, and ethnobiology sort of falls between the cracks, unfortunately.
Well, my mentor Schultes once told me, when in speaking about his frustration about the failure of ethnobotany to spread in the academic world, he said, if you can't get students interested in rainforests, naked people, and hallucinogenic plants, you should be in some other discipline.
That sounds like him.
But he was proven wrong. However, one of my favorite descriptions of ethnobotany I heard in an old interview with you where you said it's renegade botany. Why did you say that?
Well, because the ethnobotanist he's a renegade botanist and a renegade anthropologist. I mean, anthropologists look at us as being these weird, that's not real anthropology. That's something scary about knowing scientific names of plants and knowing about the names of chemicals. And yet, my mentor, not exactly my mentor, but John Terborg, the tropical ecologist who first took me to Peru, he would describe me as he's an ethnobotanist, because I clearly knew more anthropology than I knew botany at that time.
Well, one of the things you're best known for in the field is your incredible ability with languages. By last count, you're up to about 10 or 11 languages that you speak. But I'm curious, your view on the point that Western scientists trying to understand the indigenous perspective, whether it's the name of a plant or the use of a plant or the name of an animal, is misconstrued or gotten wrong or underestimated for lack of linguistic ability. And one of my favorite examples of this, I was in Madagascar about 30 years ago, and I saw the Indri, which is the weirdest lemur of all in the rainforest in the east, and I said, what do you call it? And they said, well, we call it babakut. And I said, but according to my guidebook here, it says the name is the Indri, and the scientific name is Indris indri. And the guide smiled and shook his head and said, in our language, Indri means, there it is.
Yeah, certainly. History is certainly full of stories of explorers and anthropologists who didn't understand the local language well enough to make those kind of distinctions. And in my case, it's not something I ever aspired to, but I just sort of seemed to have a natural knack for picking up languages. I actually started out interested in archaeology, and I went on some archaeological digs in Europe, in Germany and Holland when I was an undergrad. But I was much more interested in learning German and Dutch during the coffee breaks than I was in the bones and stuff that were coming out of the ground. So I realized, maybe I should try something where languages are a bit more key to it. But yeah, I mean you can never get the same information through translation as you can from understanding a language. And there's just so many examples of this. I mean, one example that happened to me in the field, which was kind of funny, was because when you're learning a new language, you're learning a new vocabulary and you're learning new grammar, but you're also learning new concepts and learning new ways of being in the world. And so one time I was out in the field in Peru with Douglas Yu with some Machiginga botanical assistants. We're collecting plants for this sort of forest survey, forest inventories. And my friend Marino Matsipango, Machiginga friend, comes to this tree. Doug was over on that line. I was on this line. We're walking down the line, collecting the plants, climbing the trees, getting the leaves. And Marino says, "Check it out." And he scrapes this plant and he hands it to me and makes me smell it. And he says, "It smells like farts." And so I said, "Hey, Doug, you gotta check this out. This is so cool. Listen to this plant. Listen to this." And Doug was like, "Shepard, you've been taking too much ayahuasca. Your senses are all confused. You don't listen to a smell. And, it's true I was taking quite a lot of ayahuasca in those days, but actually what had happened was that my sense vocabulary had gone native, because the Machiginga term for smelling is kemainkaki, which means to sense or to listen to a vapor or an odor or something in a gaseous state. And so that specific instance of synesthesia, which when you mix the senses, wasn't owed to psychedelics. It was the fact that I was thinking in my English vocabulary had gone native. And so I was using the Machiginga concept of to listen to an odor, which is what you do, which is the word to smell. And examples like that, I mean, of course, there's that age-old urban legend about the Eskimo words for snow, which turns out to be not quite that true. This idea that different languages encode the world in completely radically different ways. I wouldn't go so far to say as that speaking a new language gives you an entirely new worldview, completely separate from another world, from your original worldview. But examples like this where you sort of can't find quite the right word, or this experience of saying, listen to this odor in English, it makes you realize how every new language that you learn sort of expands your mind in a certain way as you learn these other ways of being in the world. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's completely completely world changing, but it does subtly change the way you perceive the world. One of the most beautiful things about the Machiginga language and a lot of indigenous languages is the use of onomatopoeia, or idiophones, which is things that sound like what they are, like cock-a-doodle-doo in English. But the Machiginga language, you can say entire phrases just using onomatopoeia. And in the mythology a lot, there's these onomatopoeic phrases that show up, like someone's waiting in the dark for his lover, and he can't go to sleep, and the word for that state of being of sort of wakefulness, quiet wakefulness, is shikiri, shikiri, shikiri. And it's like the sound of your eyes moving back and forth, shikiri, shikiri. It's like someone who can't get to sleep, your eyes moving, shikiri, shikiri. And so there's this expression that Machiginga hunters use. When hunters come back from the hunt, they'll often explain their hunt and all these details, and they use a lot of onomatopoeia. And so there's this great Machiginga onomatopoeia that tells a whole story with just sound. So this is it. It's tsensek motok sakara putak huenga. And that is, tsensek is the sound of the arrow leaving the bow, tsensek. And then motok is the sound of an arrow hitting a hollow chamber, like a chest, motok. Sakara is the sound of the animal, the monkey, hitting leaves as it comes down. Putak is something hitting the ground. And then huenga is the animal's final breath, huenga. So, tsensek motok sakara putak huenga. The guy, what he's saying is, I went in the forest, I saw a monkey, I shot it right in the chest, it fell out of the tree and hit the ground, and I saw it take its last breath.
Quite a story. I mean, I don't have your linguistic abilities, but I've certainly noticed the same thing with onomatopoeia. I was reading an account of the travels of Charles Waterton, and then a historical account of the account of Charles Waterton. And the writer was criticizing Waterton for not using scientific names, because he said, oh yeah, Waterton was talking about this bird called the feifeo. And we'll never know what that was. Well, anybody who spent 5 minutes in the Amazon is exactly what it is. It's a screaming pia. A feifeo is the noise they make. A screaming pia doesn't tell you anything. Or in cases where these so-called primitive languages, he says in air quotes, have words that we don't. For example, the trios have a word for the inside of the elbow and the back of the knee. Now, it takes me 4 words for each of those. So once again, this idea that, well, if somebody doesn't have a last name or doesn't have a pair of pants on, that they know less than we do or they're less clever is obvious nonsense. And we could just go down this hole of indigenous languages and lessons we can learn from them. But it just shows that ethnobotany has sort of been considered too reductionist. Like, okay, they got a list of plants they use, and we want that list of plants. What phase of the moon is it collected in? What part of the tree? How's it prepared? What's it mixed with, if anything? So it just gives a look into the richness of these cultures and how little we know, despite the fact that it's passing. And just to go back to your earlier point, we're looking at the candle burning at both ends, because we have an interest in shamanic cultures, particularly in hallucinogens, as never before. At the same time, these forests, these plants, these fungi are being destroyed faster than ever before. So that's the irony in which we live.
And, it is true that some ethnobotany tends to be lists of plants. Like, here's a list of plants. This is the indigenous word. This is the scientific name. This is how they use it. That's certainly an important part of ethnobotany, that basic documentation. But I think talking about the present and the future of ethnobotany, what intrigues me most about ethnobotany is that is the first step to creating this dialogue. Well, they have a word for something, for this plant, and they have a use for it. And through botanical collections and through anthropological interviews, you can sort of make the connection. Well, this is the plant they use to treat whatever disease, and this is what it is in botanical terms, and this is their translation of whatever illness it is: headache or bone sprain, bone break, or diarrhea. But for me, what becomes more interesting is when you can understand what it is about that plant that makes it function in that way for them. And so in my research, what I discovered, what I found out was that connection between, it's one thing to say, oh, this plant treats headache. Well, why does that plant treat headache? And most ethnobotanists or anthropologists for them don't really ask that kind of question. But when you start asking that question, what I found was that most of the time, the connection between the plant use and the efficacy, how they understood the use of that plant, had to do with sensory properties of the plants, whether it's a taste or an odor. And there we go back to the tree that smelled like a fart. The indigenous people use these complex notions of odor, taste, texture, the color of plants. They make these complex associations between the properties of the plants, we call the chemosensory properties of the plants, and the efficacy of the plants. And there was fascinating examples. Sometimes they are direct, like, oh, this is a plant that's bitter, so therefore it kills whatever invisible microbes are in your belly. But sometimes the connections are a bit more complex. I remember with the Yaminawa, herbalists that I was working with, we were walking through the forest, and I was trying to understand this concept. They had this concept of there's a whole category of plants that they call huidarao. Huidarao means wasp medicine and wasp illness. Rao in the Yaminawa language means medicine and illness at the same time. And so huidarao, and they say, you see this plant here? You're walking by this plant, you're minding your own business, and yet, just like a wasp nest, this plant has this angry spirit and it attacks you, and it makes you sick. And you have to figure out which wasp plant gave you the wasp illness to make you better. And there's a categorization of dozens of illnesses that they associate with the stings of different wasp species. So some wasp species sting you and give you a headache. Some of them sting you and make you vomit blood. Some of them sting you and give you these this sort of rashes all over your body. And so they associate different illnesses with these different wasp spirits, and then they associate those wasp spirits with these different wasp plants. And most of the wasp plants have spines and or red latex associated with the wasp, the painful, bloody, stings that the wasps give. And so often when ethnobotanists find those kind of symbolic associations, doctrine of signatures associations, air quotes on the doctrine of signatures, that kind of knowledge is rejected. Oh, that's not scientific. That's pure symbolic reasoning. It's not effective. But if you think about these orally transmitted cultures, if a plant is easy, if it works, then you have to find some way of having it remembered. So a plant that is both effective for treating illnesses and is easy to remember is going to last a longer time. And so I think that these chemosensory evaluations and color evaluations and texture evaluations, they're part of a complex cosmological understanding of how plants interact with the human body. But they're also mnemonic techniques that help that knowledge be transmitted through the generations. And so I think that there's this fascinating element of ethnobotany, which is going beyond the plants and the uses and thinking about this deeper cultural context, the utilitarian context and the cosmological context that makes that plant significant. And, when a plant is no longer useful for society, it's going to be forgotten. And so part of the challenge of ethnobotany is understanding these use concepts and finding ways for people, young people, to engage with the importance of if the plant is used to make you a better hunter with a bow and arrow, and you don't use the bow and arrow anymore, that plant is going to be forgotten. But there's all of these new things like playing soccer, and what's happening is what I've observed in Peru, the plants that people used to use, magical plant, quote unquote magical plants, they would put on their hands and put in their eyes to be better hunters. You can also use those plants to be better soccer players. And so, we have to get over this static view that, everything's being lost and they're forgetting all their knowledge. That knowledge has to evolve. And the way it's evolved and transmitted is through these complex cosmological sensory understandings.
Well, I'm a collector, as I guess all of us ethnobotanists are, of examples where indigenous people say something that Westerners, usually scientists, dismiss as indigenous mumbo-jumbo, which turn out to be based in fact. Jeremy Narby's new book on tobacco and ayahuasca has this great story where one of the tribes in Peru calls the tobacco hornworm, this caterpillar, the mother of tobacco. This concept of el dueño de los tapires, this sort of stuff, which Westerners like, the mother of the owner of, this is a bunch of nonsense. Well, further research has found out that the tobacco hornworm caterpillar eats nicotine, eats tobacco leaves. And the way it is capable of doing that is it's evolved this protein which denatures the nicotine. But the story doesn't end there, that is able to secrete the nicotine and then exhale nicotine to keep predatory spiders away.
Wow.
So this mother of tobacco is quite the mother.
That reminds me of some research I was doing with Lewis Daly, who's a recent PhD in ethnobotany out of Oxford. And he was working on this category of plants in Guyana, used by the Makushi, the Carib-speaking Makushi people. And they're used all throughout the Guyana as, they're called binas. They're basically, ethnobotanists treat them as charm plants, sort of magical plants. And many of them are Araceae, arum family, elephant ear, calla lily family.
Most of them.
And he was in these bina plants, these Araceae plants, they give shamans use them to extract powers, healing powers and also killing powers. And so the shaman was explaining to him how he extracted these invisible crystalline darts from the plant that he can use to protect himself, and then you can shoot the darts out and kill your enemies or kill those who are attacking you, sort of shamanic warfare. And so Lewis got very interested in this. What do these darts look like? And so he had this 80-year-old man draw. He says, what do these darts look like? He expected to see some incredible drawing of he said they're sort of like macaw feathers, but they're sort of like crystals. And what he drew was these tiny, tiny, tiny little lines in circles on a piece of paper. It was like on a sheet of lined paper, and they were just these tiny little things. And Lewis was a bit disappointed. Well, I guess the guy's eyesight's going. It didn't make any sense to him, and he sort of held on to that picture. And then he came to work with me at the Gale Museum in Brazil, and I said, well, why don't we take a look at the phytochemistry of these plants, of these Araceae plants? And it turns out these plants are loaded with these chemicals called raphides. And what raphides are is literally microscopic crystals of calcium oxalate. And so this almost blind octogenarian shaman was describing a microscopic process. There's a microscopic crystals. And it was an example of where, the anthropologists have thought about this kind of attack shamanism and sorcery and magic darts in an entirely symbolic way. These are symbols. And, the botanists have assumed that these plants are magical, and therefore they, why would you want to look at their chemistry? And when you sort of look at with this dual, let's think about the symbolism. They understand these things as being invisible crystals that the shamans extract and send out. And then look at the chemistry, and lo and behold, they've been telling us, these Makushi shamans have been telling us for centuries now, that these things are loaded with microscopic crystals. And that is the beauty of ethnobotany, is taking a piece of information that's found in the botany and found in the chemistry, but no anthropologist would ever think that will be relevant to understanding symbolic cosmological complex. And you combine those two pieces of knowledge, and suddenly you have something that adds to the anthropological understanding and adds to the botanical understanding.
Well, speaking of shamans, I want to read one of the most evocative paragraphs I've ever read about shamans and shamanism. Quote, "Not even the sky is the limit. The greatest shamans ascend beyond the heavens to mingle with immortal spirit beings, the very gods of creation, who defend and perpetuate the universe through their ceaseless war against the forces of chaos and evil." That was written by our guest, Glenn Shepard. So, Glenn, I want you to give your definition of what a shaman is for our listeners, and what is the future of shamanism in an ever-changing, technologizing world?
Shamans are specialists who find different techniques of going into altered states of consciousness. They can be meditation, they can be breathing, they can be plants, they can be drugs. And these specialists go into altered states of consciousness to come into contact with these spirit beings or cosmological forces or psychological forces, however you want to define it, for the good of their patients and of themselves and for humanity. And what I was writing about in that quote was about the Machiginga shamans of Peru, who their belief is that the shamans take plants like ayahuasca and brugmansia, kind of datura, and other psychoactive plants, tobacco, and through that melding of the plant and the person, they create a spirit twin who lives in the spirit world, a parallel, they call it like a twin brother who lives in the spirit world. And as their powers grow in the physical world, their spirit twins' power grow in the spiritual world. And when great shamans die, the Machiginga say their bodies don't rot away. They climb up into the heavens and they rejoin with their spirit twins, and they become stars, or they become spirit beings, and they basically become identical to gods. And in the history of Western religion, we know there's exactly one human being who transcended death and went into the heavens and went back to sit at the right hand of God, Jesus Christ. That's our mythology. For the Machiginga, that transcendent immortality is available to anyone who takes up the shamanic path. So it's a much more democratic kind of religion, where basically anyone who follows this path is on the pathway to becoming divine.
Well, speaking of shamans ascending to the stars, our late friend Darrell Posey was in the Xingu in the southeast Brazilian Amazon about 40 years ago, and he was sitting next to the Xingu River with a great Kayapo shaman. And it was one of those beautiful Amazonian nights with millions, if not billions, of stars overhead. And something streaked across the sky. And Darrell said, "That is a satellite. That was done by my people." And the shaman looked at him and said, "My people have been doing that forever."
Now, when we talk about the future of shamanism, there are a number of things going on in the world, some of which are promising, some of which are frightening, some of which are worrying. Western religion, Western civilization has made incredible progress with technology and communication, travel, and yet that all of these technological and communicational wonders still leave people feeling like something is missing. And there's been this incredible process over the past 30, 40 years where Westerners have gone to the Amazon to seek out ayahuasca and other traditional plants, looking for some sort of spiritual path or spiritual relief that they're not getting back at home. And as strange as it seems, now there's ayahuasca and multiple Amazonian indigenous plants, frog venom, being served practically every country of the world every night at every yoga studio around. Every yoga studio there's probably an ayahuasca session going on somewhere, and so there's been this incredible international expansion of Amazonian shamanism, especially ayahuasca, but not only ayahuasca and tobacco and frog venom and sanango, psilocybin. I mean, the original shamanic expansion was the Gordon Wasson's description of the magic mushroom, and there was a huge migration of hippies to Oaxaca to try that, and then the home growing of psilocybin, and now the same thing is happening with ayahuasca, and it's a mixed bag, because on the one hand, people who suffering from addiction, people with depression, have found a relief for their suffering, and through that relief have tried to help others with that, with these plants. But at the same time, you always read about, of course, you always hear the bad stories more than the good stories. And there's always a story of someone who freaked out on ayahuasca and killed someone, or had a psychotic breakdown. There's been several very tragic stories in Peru and Brazil where people had psychotic breakdowns on ayahuasca and killed shamans or killed religious leaders. And so now, as the psychedelic revolution, sort of the second wave psychedelic revolution, with finally, after all these years of prohibition, the U.S. government is allowing people to go back to research on psilocybin and different psychoactive plants. There's a lot of capital flowing now into the research of these plants. And, on the one hand, I want these plants to be able to help people. And a lot of indigenous people feel the same thing. We don't have we have no problem with bringing our knowledge, letting our ayahuasca traditions help the world, but we need to receive something in return. And that's the piece that we've never been very good at. And that's the piece that worries me. It actually worries me more than there's always going to be casualties in all of these sort of, settings, whether it's therapy or, psychedelic therapy, or, there are people who are just not able to, for whatever psychological reasons, are not able to handle those situations and have problems. You can't avoid that. That's sort of all medical interventions have a certain risk. All interventions have that risk. But what really worries me is these indigenous shamans who travel the world and who share their knowledge, and then when they're sick, when they need help, everyone forgets about them and moves on to the next one. And there's sort of been this capitalist machine taking indigenous shamans around the world and exploiting them, and then turning them back home where they no longer fit into their communities are jealous because you made all this money and you've been traveling the world and you haven't been around and you've been healing white people, and so they don't. But then they're old and they're sick, and their former impresarios don't want to help them out anymore, and these people sort of get lost between two worlds. And I think that's very worrisome, and I don't see an easy solution to that. And any attempt to sort of regulate things always turns into this other bureaucracy that then becomes a problem. So it's something, the world seems desperate for this kind of spiritual awakening. Indigenous peoples are providing tools for doing that kind of spiritual awakening, and yet are they seeing any benefits from it? And that's the part that worries me.
Well, I'm happy to see so many people paying so much more interest to benefit sharing, but I'm very frustrated to see that the benefits will be later. And having grown up on Popeye cartoons, I call this the wimpy approach to benefit sharing. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for some ayahuasca today. Yeah. And so, yes, I mean, this is a problem where we should have tried to solve it a lot earlier. The toothpaste is out of the tube, a lot of it, but it's not too late to try and do better. And I share your frustration and your hope. Also, I want to get your opinion on the fact that so many of these psychoactive substances are available on the internet, whether it's psilocybin or ayahuasca or Cambo toad. And these people think, well, if I can buy it on the internet, what do I need a shaman for?
Everywhere. It's just shocking. You go on the internet and the amount of amount of everything that you can buy on the internet is sort of overwhelming. And why do you need shamans? Because shamans belong to traditions that have used these plants safely for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And there's secrets to preparation, physically, like how you prepare it, what do you mix it with, but there's also songs and myths and cosmological beliefs and practices that set those plants and their tremendous and sometimes dangerous powers within certain safeguards, certain guardrails. And when people just buy a plant off the internet and start taking it, the guardrails are all off. And you get, it could easily go into a situation like, what LSD did in the 60s and 70s, where there was all of this recreational use without any sort of ritual social controls that had evolved through in these traditions. And that's when you get the worst kind of casualties, when people are using plants without respect, without care, without understanding their powers and their dangers, and you have these casualties, these people who freak out, who hurt themselves or hurt other people, and without the shamanic knowledge there to create those guardrails, it's easier for that to happen.
Well, as ethnobotanists, we're always interested in how these shamans train. And I asked an ayahuasca shaman once in Colombia about his training. He said, well, a very important part of our training is about shielding. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, we're dealing with sick and dying people all the time. And if we don't shield ourselves, that sickness and illness can jump to us. And sometimes it does, but we know how to get rid of it. That's why there's so much suicide, divorce amongst your doctors, because they don't understand this concept of shielding. And I was asked to give a commencement address at Tulane University Medical School as a native of New Orleans. And I asked the oldest shaman that I knew, was a 92-year-old ayahuasquero. He's the paramount shaman of the Ngano peoples, where Schultes first encountered ayahuasca in the 40s. And I said, how long did it take you to learn to be a shaman? He says, in your yardstick, I'm 92 years old. He said, I'm still learning.
Yeah, there's no end to it. It's an endless path.
Yeah, and also I then asked him, when did you start with ayahuasca? Is it true you give ayahuasca to children? He said, absolutely not. I didn't start drinking Remedio until I was 5 years old. So one other misunderstanding of hallucinogens, which you've touched on, and very few other people do, is us white people, or foreigners, or brown people, or yellow people, tend to think of hallucinogens as something the shaman takes for curing. But in my experience, and yours, based on stuff of yours that I've read, it's not just about healing, that hallucinogens are often very much a part of preparation for the hunt. Also, for finding lost objects. People didn't really carefully read Gordon Lawson's classic 55 article in Life magazine about the magic mushrooms, because some of those ceremonies were to find lost objects.
Yes. I mean, when you ask the Machiginga, to this day, why do you take ayahuasca? To be a better hunter. I take ayahuasca, I go to the forest, and Tsinsek motok sakara potagang hoenga. I kill 2 monkeys, And so they most of the Machiginga that I was working with, in the 90s, 2000s, ayahuasca wasn't really much about healing at all. It was about hunting. And what they say is that when you take ayahuasca, you enter into the realm of these forests, these guardian spirits, the dueños. You develop relationships with them, and you make exchange. You make exchanges. You wheel and deal. And so basically, and part of that wheeling deal, in the case of healing, part of that wheeling and dealing can be recovering souls that have been taken, souls that have been lost, to help the person feel better, or to remove some intrusive spirit that's in a person. But that's only one small part of this larger cosmological role of the shaman, which is to negotiate with the forces that control the universe. And for indigenous peoples, still living in hunting situations, hunting and gardening situations, a big part of their social well-being has to do with having enough fish, having enough game, and having good returns on their agriculture. And so, by taking ayahuasca, they meet up face to face with these spirit beings who control these matters of life and death, who can release or hide the game animals. And so for them, hunting is really a bigger part of ayahuasca than healing. And I think in the past, I think that older ayahuasca traditions that you read about in the literature seem to be focused on these issues of divining, hunting, warfare, predicting when the enemy is going to attack. And I think it's only been more recently, and maybe even in contact with Western thought patterns, that it's become so focused on healing as a medicine, devoid of these other aspects. And another thing that happens is that, a big part, and this is the dark side of shamanism, is that, the shaman has the power to heal and the shaman has the power to kill. As the 80-year-old man drawing for Louis Daly those little crystals, those crystals that you absorb that power to protect and to kill with. And so there's a certain whitewashing that takes place when ayahuasca tourists go to Iquitos or Tarapoto or Pucallpa to take ayahuasca with these indigenous shamans. That side of the sorcery and the attack, this idea of you remove an illness that's been caused by someone, but then you send the illness back to the one who sent it. And that element of sorcery, which is so important in Amazonian shamanism, it gets whitewashed a bit out of the package that people are being sold in tourism, where they're talking about global healing and healing the planet, and people are much more focused. Western tourists are much more focused on their own personal childhood traumas, and they go to ayahuasca for that kind of healing, whereas indigenous shamans are looking at these cosmological forces, and there's kind of a misfit between what Western psychologizing Western enthusiasts are seeking and what indigenous shamans are used to using in their own cultures. And so there's this, but again, there's this incredible dynamism, and some of these indigenous shamans and mestizo shamans have created this sort of curious mixture of, there's a bit of Jung, there's a bit of Pachamama, Andean cosmology, there's a bit of Amazonian cosmology, there's some Freud thrown in there, there's some primal scream therapy, and the shamans, if they're anything, shamans are famous for being improvisers, bricoleurs, who sort of combine things, and they're always creating something new. And so at first, when you're coming out of a ethnographic context like I have, where you're working with these shamans who are out there negotiating with the forest spirits to become better hunters, and then you run into these indigenous shamans who are citing New Age literature and so on. It's a bit off-putting at first, but then when you think about it, these things are always evolving, and I think we always look on indigenous peoples as being somehow representing the past. They're stuck in the past, and they're this romanticized sort of caregivers of a nostalgic idea that we have of the past, and they have to stay that way so that we can not feel so bad about being the way we are. And all people are always changing. And I think shamanism right now is this incredibly dynamic field where there's this incredible mixing of traditions of indigenous and Western spiritist traditions and so on. And so it's not so much that we're losing, we are losing rainforest. When you lose the forest, you lose the plants, and you lose the indigenous peoples, and you lose everything. But as long as indigenous peoples have their lands and have political control, legal political control over those forests, and they're not being forced to cut it down or to sell off resources by these outside forces, all more power to them to negotiate and to improvise and to create these new cosmologies that are evolving all the time. And it can be very fascinating to see, a shaman that I met a long time ago has now been out in the world and dealt with other indigenous shamans and Andean shamans and been in Western therapeutic sort of context, and then comes back and creates this new, dynamic, incredibly rich thing, which is the evolving world of what they call neo-shamanism.
Yes, I have to smile a bit because certainly the most powerful shamans I've ever met, the very few most powerful, had a white and a dark side, without question. Secondly, this whole shamanism versus neo-shamanism, we're certainly in uncharted waters. And I was suppressing a smile recently when I was listening to somebody gas on at a DC cocktail party about they just went to this totally traditional ayahuasca ceremony in Costa Rica. First of all, ayahuasca is not native to Costa Rica. And then they took DMT and ketamine, and then they smoked marijuana when they were coming down. Well, to me, that's pretty clearly neo-shamanism. That's not traditional. I think we're all interested in what works. But you do have a lot of people, even indigenous peoples, who will go to a workshop for a weekend and then announce that they are El Indio Amazonico and stick a feather through their nose. And that's not quite the same thing as somebody who's been studying this and doing this for 50 or 60 or 70 years. So I don't want to issue a value judgment here, but I do think in this age we live in that people need to remember the old Latin saying, let the buyer beware. And just because somebody's got good reviews on the internet doesn't mean they're a great shaman. And people can come apart emotionally in these settings if they're not really under the care of somebody who knows what they're doing and there isn't the proper supervision.
And especially when the motive is profit, you've got to be very careful because if anything makes the dark side come out full force, it's money.
Let me add to that. Money, number 2 is power, and number 3 is sex.
Yes. And there have been some very disturbing cases of sexual assault and abuse, and that's something that, that people, that powerful, usually men from Latino cultures, Peruvian culture, which tends to be a machista culture, it's this powerful blend of, powerful man, lots of gorgeous blonde women, and it happens. And it's something that people need to be aware of.
Well, I want to move into the Amazon a bit deeper and not just focus on shamans. But before we do that, I want to ask you, what can shamans cure that Western physicians cannot in some cases?
Anything, really. I mean, if you think about what, we talk about the placebo effect as if it's something to be studied and pushed aside and minimized and gotten rid of. Dan Moorman wrote a wonderful book about the meaning effect, rather than treating the placebo effect as this effect that you're trying to get rid of using statistics. What indigenous medicine does, whether it's ethnobotanical or shamanic, is that it takes advantage of the fact that human beings are animals who are moved by symbols. Because of language, symbols move us. They create emotions in us. They can affect our immune systems. And so I think shamanism is uniquely powerful in using religious and cosmological symbols combined and ritual interventions combined with the amplifying effects of psychoactive substances to alter our immune responses. Personally, the shaman or the patient, and then intersubjectively, where the shaman uses his or her insight into cosmological realms to intuition to figure out what's wrong with this person and how can I make those adjustments. And the shamans can perceive these as color patterns or as spirits coming in and out. But on a deeper level, they're making adjustments to the person's immune responses. And that is what's referred to as the placebo effect or the meaning response. I think shamans are indigenous shamans and neo-shamans, the ones who know what they're doing. They've figured out through an intuitive way to make subtle changes to people's immune responses. And if that power could be amplified, you could cure anything. And you hear stories. I mean, it's kind of, when you think about spiritual healers, even religious healers in the West, there's always those sort of what do you call them, like outlier events where someone's got a terminal tumor and they go to a church or they go to a lay healer or someone lays on the hands or they go to a shaman and that tumor's gone in 2 weeks or a month, and it's completely off the medical statistic charts. They're called miracles. And miracles happen. Miracles happen. And I think shamans and spiritual practitioners who know what they're doing intuitively figure out how to make miracles happen. And I think that's one of the great blind spots of Western medicine is the placebo effect. And it's because of, obviously a drug company wants to sell a drug that works, quote unquote works, and it's not functioning through some sort of symbolic placebo effect. But if we could think of a new medicine that goes beyond the chemicals and the substances and the double-blind clinical trials, that starts to understand the deeper realm of physical, spiritual, mental healing, the way shamans have and spiritual healers from around the world have, I think there's a path forward where the biochemical, the sort of pharmacological and the spiritual, psychological aspects of medicine could come back together to create healing for any illness that one could imagine. Because in the end, what illness is there's something that comes from the outside, and some people respond to it in one way, some people respond to it another way. People get sick. In the end, when you get better, it's because your immune system has figured out how to fight that thing off. And that's what shamans do the best, is retune the immune system to fight off illness.
Yeah, I'm from the Deep South, and I've been to tent revivals, and I've seen faith healers, and they'll lay their hands on somebody in a wheelchair or on crutches, and sometimes they'll get out of that wheelchair and walk, and sometimes they'll put down the crutches and walk, and sometimes they'll put down the crutches and fall over. The point being that no medicine works for everything. And I totally agree with you that shamans, real shamans, are masters of the show. And I mean that in a positive sense. Some of the shamanic medicine is, it's like, okay, you got a rash, they rub a leaf on it. You got a bee sting and they rub a leaf on it. But where there's an emotional component, a spiritual component, invisible component, that's where they're the masters. And people don't understand how much of that placebo, which I'm totally in favor. I'd rather be cured by the placebo effect than by surgery, assuming it works, which it does sometimes. Just like surgery, it does sometimes, not always. But here's a perfect analogy. You go to the drugstore, and the guy behind the counter is wearing a white coat. Now, why does the guy wear a white coat? He's not mixing anything up in the back. He could wear anything. But if the guy came out from the back of the pharmacy wearing a dirty Grateful Dead T-shirt, dirty dreadlocks, and dirty toenails, you would think, ooh, where you see this guy all in white, and you're thinking, okay, it's clean, it's hygienic, I'm already getting healed. And maybe that's something that medical schools could teach from the shamans about the importance of ritual in a way which reinforces this effect, which doesn't say, oh, you don't need the antibiotics, let me wave the maracas over you and you'll be fine.
And I think this is where I think psychoactive plants have a unique place in this realm of healing because of the way they alter brain function. And people who fall ill, whether spiritual illness or physical illness, there's almost always some emotional component to many illnesses. And something about psychoactive substances in ritual settings, Victor Turner, the great anthropologist of ritual, talks about how rituals take the people participating in a ritual enter this liminal state. They're taken out of the regular social. They're taken out of the regular social space and put into this special ritual space where it's like a dream logic. It's the logic of myth and dreams, and by being in that liminal space, you do things in ritual. You achieve things through symbolic steps, and the initiate or the person going through a ritual comes out changed by that. It's a socially sanctioned space where you go in and through symbols you make changes, and the person comes out, reintegrates with the society, but in a changed way because of that ritual space. And psychoactive substances, shamanic substances are always used in rituals. And I think what happened, and so the ritual state itself is a kind of altered state of consciousness. If you've ever gone to mass or participated in any ritual, you know that,
or watching a movie,
or even watching a movie, it changes you. So when you in a social setting where you agree to suspend ordinary sort of conscious rules, social rules and enter this ritual space, that in and of itself is a kind of altered state of consciousness. And then when you combine that with psychoactive plants, it has this multiplier potential to alter physiology, to alter emotions, but the key thing is ritual and shamanism go hand in hand, because without the ritual component, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. And so someone suffering from an illness or from a psychological illness or from depression or from cancer goes online and buys a bunch of ayahuasca or ibogaine or whatever, and then takes it without this protective ritual space that's built around it, and it's like throwing gasoline on the fire, and the person can just go off the edge. But the important place of shamans is to, through these traditions that have been learned over hundreds of years, they know what they're doing. They know how to create, whether it's with songs or with rattles or with feathers or with dance. They know they've learned these techniques, these ritual techniques that create a safe and productive space where that psychoactive plant can have its ritual impact, have its impact on psychology, on emotions, on the spirit, and then the person's able to come back safely and reintegrate into society rather than going off the deep end.
And a coda to that, if you wander off into the woods, figuratively or literally, because both happen, they know how to pull you back. I was in Oaxaca doing a mushroom ceremony with the Mazatecs just a couple of months ago, and all of a sudden things took a dark turn, and I was in real trouble. And the shaman grabbed me, rolled up my sleeves, and began rubbing Nicotiana rustica into the insides of my elbows to protect me and pull me back. And on that note, we're going to go on to the second segment in a few minutes, so stay tuned.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, join us for part 2 of this thought-provoking discussion with Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Shepard as we revisit a plant of the gods from earlier this season, tobacco.